In this video, we're going to talk about internationalization in NextJs 13 app router. We're going to build a simple app together, which has two pages, an about page and a home page. And we're also supporting two languages or two different locales, English and German. So by clicking on these links, we're going to be redirected to a subpath. This is a pattern that we're going to learn. There is a different pattern, which is a domain routing, which you would just redirect the users to a different domain or subdomain. We're using the subpath strategy where we're just redirecting the user to a different subpath of our domain. In this case, this .de is representing Deutsch or German, which takes them to the German version of our site. Now, let's just jump back into this little note that I have here so we understand the parts and pieces involved in implementing internationalization in NextJs 13, specifically in the app router. And then we're going to actually jump into the code and build that app that I just showed together. Now, internationalization refers to serving up content in your user's preferred language. This is typically coming from the accept language header from the browser, depending on the country that they're living or the language preferences that they have set up inside of their browser. Now, this process involves two different parts, the routing part and the actual localization, which is just a translation or localizing that string, that text that you're actually showing to your users. Now, the routing, which is handled by NextJs, has two different strategies. As I just touched on, you can either use the path routing strategy or the domain routing strategy. Now, in the path or the subpath routing strategy, you're going to redirect the user or put the locale in the URL path. So, for example, you have /blog as your default route, and then you would have /fr/blog, which is for French, or NL, which is for Dutch in Netherlands, or in the case of our app, using Deutsch or German for Germany. Now, in the domain routing strategy, you're actually redirecting the user to a different domain or subdomain of your application. For example, example.com would be your default locale, maybe in English. For French, you would just redirect them to example.fr or .nl for Dutch. In the example that we just saw together, we're going to implement subpath routing, but it would be similar for domain routing because this is all happening inside of a middleware that we're going to set up together. Now, one thing that I want to note before moving forward is the app router in NextJs 13 does not have a built-in support for internationalization, just like how the pages router had. You could have set up your locales that you wanted to support in your next config in NextJs 12 in the pages router. For now, the app router doesn't have that. But the good news is that we can actually implement it very easily using two packages and a middleware, which we're going to see together. Now, the second part or piece of this internationalization is localization, as I just mentioned. And this is the kind of translating your texts, your strings into that language or that preferred locale that the user has. Now, this part is typically handled by third-party libraries like NextIntel, which are going to provide some convenient ways for you to either read from your local dictionaries that you create, or it's going to be handled by your CMS. For example, if your data is coming in from a content management system and that provides or supports different locales, you'd have to create different versions of your content on the CMS and then fetch it depending on the locale that the user is on to show them the correct content. Now, let's just talk about the routing, which is the first piece of the puzzle here. So we're going to use these two packages, the format.js Intel local matcher and the negotiator, to actually understand the preferred language that the user has by reading the headers from the incoming request inside of a middleware. So we're going to create a function called getLocale. This is going to receive the request object. This negotiator requires a plain object, so we're just mapping over the key value pairs inside of the headers of our request and mapping the values into a plain object so we can pass it to this new negotiator, and then call this languages function to get the preferred languages of the user based on the request. And then we're going to match the languages that are preferred by the user to the locales that we want to support. So we're going to set some settings inside of our app, either in the middleware, or I'm going to show you how I prefer to do it inside a separate file to have this default locale, and the different locales or languages that we want to actually support, we pass all of them to this match locale function that we get. I just realized that there is a typo here, so this is as match locale. So you're getting this match function as match locale from this package. This is going to help us to pass the preferred languages of the user and the locales and default locale that we provide to give us back a locale that best matches what the user prefers. Now we're going to use this information inside of a middleware to actually redirect the user to what we think it's probably the language that they prefer. So this is again the same thing that we have. We have the packages here. We have defined our locales. We have this getLocale function. Again, we're going to see this in the code, so don't worry if you can't follow it here. But from a high level, we are getting the locale based on the request, and then we're just redirecting the user to a URL that implements that locale that we got out of this getLocale function, which was using these two packages to match the locale that the user actually prefers. And down here again, we have a regular config that we're exporting from our middleware to tell NextJs for which paths should this middleware actually run. Here, we're just running it for all the paths, and we're skipping our static underscore NextJs folder with this negative look ahead regular expression. Now, the second step to this, after we having this middleware, is to actually put all of our files, layouts, and pages inside of a dynamic lang or locale folder inside of our app directory. So therefore, we have access to that specific lang or locale inside of our page components or layouts, like so. This is using regular dynamic parameters in your React Server components or pages, which is this dynamic parameters, just like this lang or ID or slug. So the same way as we handle any other dynamic route, we would just handle this lang as well, and we put everything inside of this lang folder in our app, including our root layout. So all of them now have access to this lang, and then we can use this combined with our local dictionaries, which is just a mapping of keys and strings in different languages to show the correct content or the correct language to our users. Which brings us to the second piece of the puzzle or part of the process, which is the actual localization. Now, this is a pattern that we're using to implement this without using any third-party library, bare bone in NextJS 13 app router. You can use third-party libraries. The most popular one is NextIntel. It does not yet support server components in a stable version. They do have a beta version for localization in server components. If you want to use it in client components, you can, and there is a stable version, but in server components it's still not there yet. But I don't think it's even necessary at this point, or for understanding how it works or the process. You can just implement it yourself the way that we're explaining it here. The main part of these libraries, or the help of these libraries, is in the localization part. As I just mentioned, it makes it easier for you to kind of map the dictionaries or the messages that you created in different languages to the actual components and elements in your pages. Now, moving on here, we are creating two dictionaries, one for English. So it's just a regular JSON. We are exporting from this file that has different keys or different scopes. These are going to be different elements on the page, and there's going to be different strings. So one for English. In this case, we're also having one for Dutch, which is just translating whatever that we had there in the product scope and the cart to translate add to cart in Dutch. Now we're going to also have to create a function to actually load these dictionaries depending on the locale that we send it to. So this get dictionary function receives the locale and then looks up to our dictionaries, which is an object containing two keys that are dynamically importing these two JSON data and then accessing these objects. So this function is going to give us the dictionary on which we can just access the different keys that we want to show the strings of our elements. Again, we're going to see this in action in the code, so it makes more sense. Now we can use this get dictionary function inside of a page component. We're going to get this locale from the dynamic part or parameter of the page, send it to this get dictionary, get our dictionary, and then use that specific dict.product.cart to get that string depending on the language that the user prefers. Now for static generation, because now all of our pages are living inside of this lang dynamic parameter, you can use the generate static params. This is a function in NextJs 13 or inside the app router that allows you to tell or instruct NextJs what pages or paths you want to generate statically at build time. You can just include all the languages or locales that you want to support. So therefore, you're going to build these pages statically. So it's going to be a near instant transition when actually users are changing locales. So with that, let's just jump into the code and implement this step by step so we have a better understanding of how this works. I have created a brand new NextJS application. This is using TypeScript and Tailwind CSS, and I'm not using the source directory. And I'm going to explain step by step what I've added to the bare bone project that you get out of running the script. So let's go inside of our app directory. As you can see, I've copied everything that comes out of the box into this lang folder. This is a dynamic parameter we have created here. So inside of it, the outermost, we have the layout. This is our root layout. Let's just look at it first. So inside of our root layout, all I have done is to add this header. We're going to look at the header in a second, but we're also getting this page parameters and accessing the lang property. This is the dynamic part or the dynamic language or locale to set this lang attribute inside of our HTML. Okay, so that's the only difference that this has compared to what you get out of the box. Now, before diving into the header, let me just actually go to the page component. Inside of our page component, we are still receiving, or we're again receiving this language dynamic parameter. We're using this get dictionary function that I'm going to show in a second, pass that language to it to get our specific dictionary so that we can use that scope to actually pull in the title and description from our dictionary instead of hard coding this H1 and subtitle. So let's look at the get dictionary function first, then I'm going to also show the dictionaries that I've created. So inside of our app, let me just close this off. I've created this lib folder. Inside of it, I have this dictionary file where I am defining this get dictionary function. And this is literally returning the correct key from this dictionary object I have up top, which is just importing these two JSON files. So going back to our app, these JSON files are actually living inside of this dictionaries folder where I have a JSON file for every locale that I want to support. Here, I'm supporting English and Deutsch or German. So I have two files, and inside of them, I have defined some scopes. So here I have navigation. These are going to be my navigation links. So I have a home and about. and I have a scope for my pages. I have a home page. On the home page, I have a title and description. So if I go back to the home page, this is going to be the title and description. And then I have an about page scope where I also have a title and a description, which is going to be these two. Now, similar to this, I also have another JSON file for the German version of the same keys. So I have the navigation, the home, and about. These are these two links. I have a page scope where I have the home and about. And again, title and description keys, which is pointing to the German version or translation of those same strings. So if I change into the German version, we can see these two translations. Now, going back to this file where I'm defining this get dictionaries function, you can see I'm importing this locale type from i18 config. So if you go to our project root directory, you can see this i18n config.ts. This is a file where we can define our internationalization settings in one place, so we can use it and pull it different places that we need throughout our application. I'm exporting this object that has my default locale or the locales that I want to support in my application. I'm also exporting this type so I can use it to type anywhere that I'm actually using this dynamic lang property inside my pages or the locales. Now, this pattern was inspired by an example from the NextJs team. So if you go to the documentation for internationalization, if you scroll down to the end of the page, you would see these two examples. One is this minimal routing and translation, and the other one is using the Next Intel package. As I mentioned, this is still not stable for server components, but this minimal routing and translation is where I got the inspiration for our own application. It's actually using the same patterns and packages there. And as you can see, they also do have this config file for i18n where they're defining these settings. Let's now have a look at our middleware. This is similar to the example that I showed in the beginning, where we're using these two packages, the local matcher and the negotiator, to first get the locale or the preferred language or locale of the user based on the headers or the accept language header that comes on the request object, and using that locale inside of our middleware to determine whether or not we want to redirect the user to a specific locale. Now, that's all we're doing inside of our middleware function. And down here in the bottom, we are also using some negative lookaheads to skip the static files in _next folder, our favicons and static images. So we're not running this middleware for our static files. It's just for our content pages that we are running it, but you can use any other matcher config that you want here to decide for what paths inside of your app you want to actually run this middleware. Now, going back inside of our app folder, you can see inside the lang, I also have this for this about page or this about folder and a page component inside of it, which is responsible for rendering the content of our about page. And again, similar to our home page, we're using this get dictionary function, and we're receiving these page parameters because all of our pages and layouts now live inside of this lang folder. They all now have access to this lang parameter or dynamic params object, where they can just use it to pass it to our get dictionary to get the correct scope or the correct language, and then depending on that access whatever it is that we are trying to show on the page. Now, going back to our app, I just want to quickly touch on this component and the header that we have inside of it. So going to our header component, this is where we're actually showing these two links and these two buttons. So let's quickly have a look at that and see what we're doing here. So inside of our header, there's just some navigation links for our navigation link. Just pay attention to that. For going to the home page, for example, I'm sending them to / and then I'm also including the locale. And for the about link, I'm also including the locale. So I'm sending them to the correct locale every time. And we're receiving this language property inside of our header component that comes from our page. So if I go back to my root layout where I'm actually rendering this header, so let's start from here. Let me just close that off. So inside of our layout, this is our outermost layout or root layout, where we also get this params object, which has access to the lang. This is again the dynamic segment. We are also passing that language down to this header component. So the header component is also aware of this specific locale, so it can use it inside of our link components and also in these two buttons over there. So going back to the header, we're receiving this lang props, and then we're using that to select the correct dictionary again to show the correct text for our navigation links in this case, but also have the locale to forward the user to the correct page when they're actually clicking on these links. Then at the end, we have this locale switcher, which is importing this i18n object we are exporting from our config. This is actually where we defined the config of internationalization in our project. So we were exporting this i18n object, and on it, there was this locales property, which is an array of different locales we're supporting. So back in the switcher, we're just getting that object, accessing different locales, mapping over them, and for each one, we're just rendering a link. These are these two buttons. That's going to just send the user to the correct link or the correct path with the locale attached to it that comes out of this function, the redirect path name function. It takes in a locale and spits out the path for which we want to actually link the user or push the user to. And just like that, we were able to implement routing and localization in NextJs 13, even though it wasn't supported in the app router out of the box. We used a middleware and two packages to read the preferred locale from the request headers, and then to match it with different locales or to the best language that we do support on our application. And we then used some local dictionaries to define different scopes and mappings for the actual localization of the string and the texts on our site. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments. If you learned something from this video, please give it a like, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.